All right. For those of you that are interested, I am testing out not YouTube, excuse me, Zoom's ability to do an AI summary of the class. I thought it might be interesting to include that, if it works, as a little synopsis for people that weren't able to attend in person for some reason. But as it is new technology, I don't have high hopes, but we have to try it to see how it works. Anything that helps a little bit of extra Torah get shared is a good thing in my book. But that's only if it actually works. If it turns out gibberish, because I don't know how well it's going to handle the use of Hebrew terminology, well, then it's just back into the scrap heap with it. But hopefully, eventually, they'll be able to figure out something that involves multiple languages in one presentation. That's not in any way, shape, or form connected to the end of last week's Torah portion, where we talked about the Tower of Babel and the scattering of languages. As I've said many times before in discussion of that Torah portion, having multiple languages should not be a barrier for humanity. It just means we have to put a little extra effort in. And that's going to be very apparent when we tackle chapter 15 of Bereshit, of Genesis, today. Chapter 15 is famous for having one of the more powerful statements of God to Avram, who he is still called Avram at this time, of the Brit, of the covenant, and of his eventual descendants. On the other hand, chapter 15 also contains elements that are slipped past as people study, because it can be quite confusing and certainly odd. Of what's taking place. And of course, as is usually the case for our study, we're going to be looking at the odd, but we will, of course, talk about the famous as we go through. So without any further ado, chapter 15, let's get down to it. After these events, Adonai's word came to Avram in a vision, saying, "Be not afraid, Avram. I am a delivering shield to you. Your reward is exceedingly great." So this is the phrase that God is the shield of Avram. Magain is, of course, one of the famous appellations of God. It is used in the bracha avot in the beginning of our Amidah. The idea that God as a protecting shield is an incredibly powerful metaphor. So God is giving him this reassurance. Don't be afraid. Verse 2. Avram said, "My Lord Adonai, what would you give me? For I am going to die accursed, and the son domestic of my house is a Damascus Eliezer." All right, so God is speaking to Avram in the language of greatness, and speaking with the idea that you will be guarded and protected, and that you will have a huge reward. But Avram is very practical, very straightforward, and very passionate about something, which is he has no children. At the moment, he has a person working for him, Eliezer, who here we are told is from Damascus, and this may be a little bit of a play on words, because he is called a Ben Meshech, and then he has said that he is a Damasek. So there's like Meshech and Mesech happening here. So there could be a little bit of literary flourish. But the practical concern is obvious, that he has somebody who works for him that is an exceedingly high status for his household, which, remember, was an enormous household by this point, not just a nuclear family as they put it. But Avram is still longing to have a child of his own, but he and Sarai have been unable to conceive, and in his mind, it seems like this is a problem, as he explains in verse 3. And Avram said, "Here to me you have not given me seed. Here the son of my house must be my heir." So he's saying, look, whatever reward you give me is going to go to Eliezer. Now, Avram trusts Eliezer and clearly respects him, but in his mind, that's not really what the best outcome should be. The best outcome should be that he and Sarai would have a child, and that child would inherit everything that Avram and Sarai have done. But that does not seem to be in the cards, at which point a reward that God mentioned back in verse 1 seems hollow to Avram in this status. But verse 4, but here Adonai's word came to him saying, this one shall not be heir to you, meaning Eliezer. Rather, the one that goes out from your body, he shall be heir to you. Meaning that you will have a biological child, and that person will be your heir. And then we get to our famous exchange between God and Avram. He brought him outside and said, pray, look toward the heavens and count the stars. Are you able to count them? And he said to him, so shall your seed be. So the phrasing here is, of course, that the offspring of Avram will be more numerous than the stars in the sky. This is a beautiful poetic statement that unlike a normal family where with a little bit of digging you can count the immediate members of it, depending upon how many maybe grandchildren or great-grandchildren a person might have, that when it comes to Avram's eventual descendants, they will be so numerous that it would be as pointless trying to count them as it is to count the stars in the sky. And this is now being firmly attached as not just the descendants of Avram spiritually or materially through Eliezer, but these will be the actual offspring, the biological descendants of Avram. And then in verse 6, now he trusted in Adonai and he deemed it as righteous merit on his part. So Avram seems to accept this statement that God has said he will have children, and he is accepting them that he will have children of his own. And indeed, they will flourish and eventually become innumerable. And Avram is now believing that more wholeheartedly. As you see from the beginning of verse 6, the he'emin is that verb form of the word that I'm sure is familiar to all of us, amen, which is a statement of affirmative belief. It is a statement of having a faithful belief that whatever has been stated will come to pass. And we continue then in the dialogue. Like I said, that's probably the most famous section of chapter 15, but from verse 7 onward, it gets more complicated. He, here we are still talking about God, said to him, I am Adonai who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. Now, that should immediately be ringing bells for those of you that have read through Torah before. The language of I am Adonai who brought you out of to blah, 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 blah. That formula has been used most famously in the later parts of the Torah as a reference to the Exodus from Egypt. I am Adonai who brought you out of Egypt to be your God, and so forth, repeated multiple times throughout the rest of the Torah. Well, here we are hearing a foreshadowing, a pre-echo, if you will, of that more famous formulation of the phrase. And this is a powerful reminder that Avram indeed was not born in the land that he is now currently in. He was born in Ur, which is in the southern area of Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq, close-ish to the area known as Kuwait. And if you recall, Avram and his family moved up into what is now modern-day Syria, into an area known as Haran, and then from there came down into the land of Israel. And now Adonai is continuing with the covenant, having already promised offspring. He is now reaffirming the status that this land will be Avram's land as well. But he, Avram here, said, my Lord Adonai, by what shall I know that I will inherit it? Okay, so you may be asking yourself, wait a minute, just a few verses ago, Avram was all amen, believing wholeheartedly in what God had promised him to have descendants. And now here, it seems like he is doubting. He is asking an additional question. Well, this is because this section of the question is still undecided. Avram seems to have accepted that indeed he will have an enormous family, that his offspring will be countless, like the stars in the sky. But now the specific promise of the land, well, that is something that he is still going to need additional affirmation of. And the affirmation we're going to get, the demonstration of this covenant, of this brit, is what I consider to be one of the more confusing episodes in the entirety of the book of Bereshit. So let's get to it. He, God, said to him, Avram, fetch me a calf of 3, a she-goat of 3, a ram of 3, a turtle dove, and a fledgling. All right, so we've got a cow, we've got a goat, and we've got a ram, and then we have 2 types of birds. Hopefully you're okay. Verse 10, he, Avram, fetched him, meaning for God, all of these, and he halved them down the middle, and put each one's half toward its neighbors. But the birds he did not have. Okay, so you're going to need to do a little imagination here, and I wish I was a better artist, or at the very least had an easy-to-use whiteboard, but I've really not found the Zoom whiteboard useful. So you're going to have to imagine he took the cow and he cut it in half. And then he put part A of the cow here and part B of the cow there. And so there is a gap between them, and the 2 halves are facing each other. And then he did the same for the goat, and he did the same for the ram. And for the birds, he did not. He did not cut the birds in half. So we've got cow, cow, goat, goat, ram, ram, and most likely bird, bird. We can talk about that when we get to our commentary on this a little bit later. Hopefully you've got that visualization, because it's going to be very important in just a moment. Verse 11, vultures descended upon the carcasses, but Avram drove them off. So we get an interruption of the ritual with a little bit of realia, with, well, vultures coming down because there are dead bodies and doing, vulture things. But Avram shoos them away. Verse 12. Now it was when the sun was coming up that deep slumber fell upon Avram, and here a fright and great darkness falling upon him. So this is where it gets especially confusing. If you find the language in the English translation confusing, I can assure you that the Hebrew is also confusing. It's why the commentators spend a great deal of time on this. And he, God, said to Avram, no, yes, no. It's the emphatic version of the verb form, that your seed will be sojourners in a land not theirs. They will put them in servitude and afflict them for 400 years. But the nation to which they are in servitude, I will bring judgment on them. And after that, they will go out with great property. As for you, meaning Avram personally, you will go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good, ripe age. But in the 4th generation, back to the community, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite has not yet reached full measure heretofore. And then we'll just get the last bits of this before we try to talk about it, because there's a lot, but I want to get everything on the board. Now it was when the sun had come in that there was night blackness, and here a smoking oven, a fiery torch that crossed between those pieces. So in this vision that Avram is having, this dreamlike state, the different pieces that he had divided are laying there, and there is a darkness about him, and he sees a fiery image, a torch, an oven that is passing between the pieces, walking between the animal parts. So far, hopefully you're with me. This is, of course, why this is known as the brit between the parts, between the pieces, because this covenant is taking place literally between the pieces. Verse 18, on that day, Adonai cut a covenant with Avram, saying, I give this land to your seed, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Kadamite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Rephaites, the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. Done. Okay, what in the world just happened? All right, well, let's talk Peshat, the sort of straightforward symbolism that seems to be playing out here. Well, what we have is a additional emphasis of the covenant, the Brit, which is between Avram and Adonai, and it is focused on this question of the land. Remember, Avram has already accepted the promise regarding his children, but he is hesitant about having full faith in the promise of the inheritance of the land. So what happens is Avram is now given a vision that he can see God passing through these pieces. The fiery symbol is generally considered to be a visionary analog for God's presence. And as such, that is giving him the idea that God is present as a participant in this ritual. Now, that's probably not completely satisfactory. Now, one of the reasons that alone is not satisfactory is because we live in a different culture than that of Avram. Avram lived, approximately 3,000 years ago, and 3,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, there were many different cultural references which were natural to them and which seem alien and baffling to us. One of them, if we go to our commentary here, is the very fact of this ritual. This is taken from a website online called Melamu. It is a repository of a lot of ancient texts from Mesopotamia, and oftentimes there are insights from those texts as to the cultural setting that would have been more familiar to different stages of our ancestry. This ritual in particular appears outside of the Torah. So let me read from their analysis. A ritual is described in cuneiform texts from Mari and Tel al-Rima in northern Iraq, dating from the time of Hammurapi. Animals were cut in half, and two parties contracted a treaty or alliance by passing between the halves. Sound familiar? This was a not uncommon way of showing that there was a treaty between the two parts of the treaty. It's be the equivalent of taking something and like a clay tablet and breaking it in half and giving one half to each side, or I guess modern you could say like a carbon copy. One copy goes to you and the carbon copy goes to someone else. That's if anybody watching still remembers carbon copies. It was a way of having both parts be represented by the two people involved in the treaty, and passing between them was a symbol of accepting that treaty. Now, some of the vocabulary used is West Semitic, perhaps because the ritual was widespread among the Amorite people in Upper Mesopotamia, different groups using different wordings. Genesis 15, 9-18, what we just read, describes a ritual for making a covenant or agreement between God and Abraham. Abraham cuts in half several animals, and a smoking furnace of firebrand passed between the halves, as we saw. Jeremiah 34 refers also to the ritual, in which a calf is cut in half and men walk between the halves to conclude their covenant. More about that later. In Mesopotamia, the covenant ritual cemented an agreement between men, although they acted with the approval of their gods and invoked their support. The biblical ritual, however, cemented an agreement between man and God. So what they are trying to explain is that this idea of cutting an animal in half and walking between the parts was a not unusual way of making an agreement one person to another. What is novel here in chapter 15 is that same language, which would have been absolutely familiar to Avram, is being used to symbolize the agreement between God and a person. That rather than just being a contract between people, this is a contract between a person, eventually a people, and God. And it's being done in a way that would be familiar with them. Now, later on, we will see different forms of language for the covenant. This divided animal and passing between it doesn't occur later on, except for, like I mentioned, the Jeremiah passage, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Instead, other language that's used in later generations of the Torah uses other language from the ancient Near East that parallels the treaty statements of kings that were found in other archaeology. So the short of it is that we could understand chapter 15 just very easily as being God is making a promise to Avram in a way that Avram would understand. That this is using language and imagery that would be absolutely at home in the culture and the experience of someone like Avram, who, as we just mentioned, came from Mesopotamia, well, quite recently. And as such, it makes a lot of sense. If God is going to help him imagine the strength of the covenant that he is promising, then of course he has to use imagery that will resonate with the person to whom God is addressing. Again, that explains why it comes in this form here and why we get different language for the covenant later on. God was always trying to speak to the needs, the emotional needs of each generation in a language they would understand. Okay, with that simple explanation sort of in place, does anyone have any questions, or shall we get into some of the other commentary, which shows us there's more going on here than just a simple treaty? Okay, so let's go ahead and see what our commentators would like to tell us. So we're going to start off here with Ibn Ezra, where he says, Bein Hagezarim, that's the between the pieces, means between the pieces. And this was the actual taking of the oath. So even though Ibn Ezra and our other commentators were not familiar with the archaeology of Mesopotamia, it not being dug up at the time, they were familiar enough with covenantal language and customs throughout the world that they recognized this for what it is. That this was the actual taking of an oath, that God is swearing to Avram in a way that he'll recognize that this is what's happening. The words of the covenant which they made before me, when they cut the calf in two and passed between the parts thereof. That's the line from Jeremiah, which, as Ibn Ezra points out, is very similar. So this is showing that it was rare, but it still persisted during even Jeremiah's time, which was many, many hundreds of years after the time of Abraham. We'll come back to why they were doing that in Jeremiah later, but for now, just see that Ibn Ezra can understand this without the benefit of archaeology and is still very much on point. We thus read in the next verse, in that day the Lord made a covenant with Avram, saying, unto your seed I have given this land. Okay, so far, so good, at least I hope. Okay. Chizkuni, however, wants to try and get us to notice some of those details. And the first one he wants us to notice is the vultures. This verse has been inserted in the Torah about Avram shooing away the vultures only in order to draw our attention to the great sensitivity of Avram. Chizkuni, like all the great commentators, realizes that the Torah doesn't waste lines. And shooing away a bird seems kind of like, well, if there was a bird, he'd shoo it away, but do we really need to tell anyone that? Did we have to tell us that Avram put on shoes, or that Avram was wearing, you know, a cloak? I mean, whatever was normally happening, why do we need to mention it? So therefore, there must be something else here. And what is it? Well, after all, the vultures were only doing what vultures were supposed to do. Avram chased them away temporarily until the presence of the Lord had taken leave of him and the covenant had been concluded. So Avram looks out and sees the vultures, and in his mind, he's like, well, that's normal. I mean, if there's a dead carcass, vultures are going to pick at it. There's nothing wrong with that. That is what vultures are supposed to do. But because I'm in the midst of this vision state with Adonai, that seems inappropriate for this activity. Yes, it's a natural part of the world, but right now I am transcending the natural, and thus they need to be removed until the actual covenant, until God's presence has concluded what it's supposed to do. Okay, just I thought that was a neat little aside from Chizkuni, but now let's get down into what the rest of this can actually mean symbolically, because you may remember it was not just they cut the animals in half, the fire went through them, and the covenant was concluded about the land. There was a digression talking about an exile for Abraham's descendants and a return. And Ramban and the other commentators feel that we need to talk about that a little bit more carefully. So it was thus alluded to Avram that, well, Abraham, and I apologize, some of the commentators call him by his eventual name Abraham, some still call him Avram as he is known at this time, and I am going to keep slipping back and forth between them. Apologies in advance. It was thus alluded to Abraham that the nations would come to abolish the sacrifices, but the children of Abraham would drive them away. So who are these vultures? These vultures, says Ramban, are symbolic of the other nations of the world. And other nations indeed tried to attack us and destroy us, which would have meant an end to the sacrifices that God had established during the giving of the Torah. Now, why would that matter? Well, of course, Abraham's children, that's us, would be very careful to try and keep all of the Torah, sacrifices included, and we would continue to repel those invaders time and time again. Now, do we fail sometimes? Yes, and we're going to have to talk about that. But in short, what Ramban is trying to say here is that even these vultures were not just doing vulture-y things, they were part of the vision. And they were reminding Avraham that his descendants would face a challenge from these other ravenous creatures, and that they would have to continue to fight against them. Now, Radak wants to add something a little bit more depth to this. Carcass is not applied to the animals which had been cut in half as part of the sacrificial procedures, meaning that this term that's used here for the bifurcation and the body parts left is not a usual term that gets applied. Therefore, the symbolism in all of this, meaning the animals laid out in this way in chapter 15, is that there would hardly be a generation in which the Gentile nations would not attempt to devour the Jewish people and to annihilate them utterly. Nonetheless, in the final analysis, God has always saved us from becoming total victims. So the length of the animals, the fact that there were multiple ones, was to remind us that this cleaving of the people would be repeated, that it would not only be one time that we would come under attack, but we would come under attack multiple times. And to also remind us, thus confirming the covenant that Avram needed, that God would, in the end, continue to deliver us so that we would never be completely destroyed. This confirms the prediction of Leviticus 26:44, that even during our darkest days, when we are being punished collectively for our sins and the sins of our fathers, our ancestors, quote, I will not despise you and allow you to be wiped out completely. In the following verse, the one we just quoted, in the verse following the one we just quoted, the Torah adds, I will remember for them the covenant I concluded with the forefathers. And who is the forest of the fathers? That would be Abraham himself. Indeed, the one that's referred to as Avraham Avinu, as the paradigm of our ancestor, of our forefather. So Leviticus predicts the coming problems that will happen, but also predicts that God will not ever allow us to be completely destroyed, and does so maybe not on our own merit, but as part of his recompense to the children of Abraham because of Abraham himself. So we see in this tableau of the bodies laid out a microcosm of Jewish history, and by God passing through it, we also recognize the eternity of the covenant, that even though there will be these multiple instances, God will still be there throughout all of it, and we will be able to overcome, we will be able to endure, and we will still be on the other side of this slaughter. Any questions so far before we get to some additional opinions on this? Let me just double check the YouTube chat. Nope, no one there. I mean, there are people there, but no one's chatting. Let's go ahead and continue then with Rabbeinu Bachya. The reason Avram had cut up the four-legged animals, but not the birds, was that the former represented the idolatrous Gentile nations, and these have been compared to animals, as it says in Psalms 22, many bulls surround me. It was also written in Daniel 8, the ram that you saw are the kings of Medes and Persia. And in verse 21 of Daniel, of the same chapter, the king of Greece is described as the he-goat. All right, so Rabbeinu Bachya is saying, why do we have the cow, the goat, and the ram? Well, because those are actually reflective of the specific ancient nations that would attack, dominate, and cause us so much trouble. And therefore, laying them out is akin to what we see in Daniel, where often the span of history is laid out in a metaphorical way. And each of these different animals is representative of the different turbulent periods we will go through. In the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, however, both in chapter 5 and chapter 2, the Jewish people are compared to doves. Seeing that Israel will continue to exist indefinitely, Avram did not cut up the birds representing it. You may remember back in our text when we were talking about the wrong direction. There we go. When he is laying out the sacrifices, that he halved them, meaning all of the animals down the middle, except for the birds. Those he did not divide down the middle. And Rabbeinu Bachya is explaining that the doves, the birds, were not cut up because they represented the enduring aspect of the Jewish people, since the Jewish people are referred to as doves in the reading of Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. Everybody got an example there. Okay. Now, we're going to continue with working on this idea of what was cut and why it was cut. But I do want to give one extra commentator that I was just running out of time, but I'll give it verbally, which is also explaining that when we look at all of these different animals laid out, they are also representative of all of the animals that eventually would be commanded in the book of Leviticus to be brought as sacrifices. So in a way, Abraham is laying out the menu of the eventual sacrificial service, that each of these animals will be one of the stars of a different sacrifice for different reasons, as the book of Leviticus will detail in its good time. So another way to imagine all of these, the collection of animals is, well, a menu of what eventually will be the standard sacrificial process. And this is sort of the A to Z of Ram sacrificing everything at once that eventually would come to represent the standard routine. Okay, but personally, I find it, especially right now, more important that we continue with this concept of how this reflects the arc of history. So let us continue here. Let's see if I can. Nope, will not all fit on one page, so we'll just have to scroll when we get to the bottom. Both what he cut in half and what he did not cut was at the command of God, even though the Torah did not mention this specifically. So what he's saying is that it wasn't just that Abraham made the decision to cut things in half. This would have been part of the instructions that he received from God in the vision. Now, the reason for cutting something in half was to show that God was making a covenant with Avram. Again, even without the benefit of archaeology, that insight was clear. God hinted to Abraham by means of these carcasses being cut in half that all the nations exiling the Jewish people would suffer a fate as that suffered by these sacrificial animals. So in a sense, these are a warning. It is not just that we will endure through the various phases of occupation and oppression by the different nations, but that those nations which occupy and oppress, will eventually suffer a fate that is akin to the fate suffered by these animals, meaning the division. Meaning, in more detail historically, they would successively fight wars, the younger one against the older one wiping out the other eventually. And so we do see this play out again and again throughout history. The Assyrians attacked, and then the Babylonians attacked the Assyrians, and then the Persians attacked the Babylonians, and then the Greeks attacked the Persians, and then the Romans overcame the Greeks, one after another after another. If you want the musical version of that, we call that Chad Gadya, which is sung at Pesach for that cycle of nation after nation after nation throughout the span of history. And of course, it's not only we that suffer, but as is being explained here, the nations themselves are also suffering, because as each one tries to rise to dominance, it is then overthrown by someone else. And Radak points out that as a very critical feature. All those nations represented different cultures, both in their secular outlook as well as in their religious orientation. All of this would be caused due to their competitive spirit, each nation trying to achieve dominance over the others. So Radak is bringing a really beautiful insight as he is analyzing the layout of the animals here, and says, look, it's not just about our passage through history and our eventual survival on the other end of each of these successive waves of catastrophe and oppression. This is also about, well, the symbolism of the animals, of the nations they represent. And we have to ask, well, why do they keep ending up in this way? Why do they keep fall? Why do these nations continue to collapse? And the answer that he gives is that it was due to their competitive spirit. This is not the healthy competitive spirit that leads a person to join a softball league. This is the competitive spirit that makes one want to dominate over someone else. And as each nation tries to achieve that dominance, they are essentially sowing the seeds for their own destruction. Such behavior, he argues, is not typical of the Jewish people. Although for a brief period in our history, the tribe of Ephraim competed violently with the tribe of Yehuda for preeminence among the 12 tribes of the Jewish people. Even during such periods, these tribes would not remain divided culturally or religiously. As it says in Isaiah 11, Ephraim will not be jealous of Yehuda, nor will Yehuda oppress Ephraim. So he does have the bravery to reflect upon our own national culture with this type of competitive and dominating spirit, and says, well, you know, there was a period where we sort of did this, as reflected in the microcosm of the Joseph story, but there was also a period when the northern tribes of Israel were fighting against the southern tribes of Judah, and the northern tribes are referred to as Ephraim. And yeah, we tried that whole domination thing, and it didn't work out well for us. And in fact, we learned that that type of competition of pursuit of dominance was a particularly poisonous cultural feature, and one that we eventually got rid of. We forswore the idea that we would seek domination over others, and instead focus on being in relationship with Adonai and with each other according to the words of Torah. Now, to signify the difference between competition among the Gentile nations and tribal warfare in Israel, God told Avram not to cut the bird in half, seeing that it represented the nation that would emerge from Avram, their founding father. Therefore, the Torah reported that Avram did not cut the bird in half. So he gives a slightly different reason for the non-dissection of the bird. It's not just because the bird was mentioned as us and in Song of Songs, and that we would endure through all of the oppression, but it is also because we would eventually outgrow the competitive dominating spirit, and thus we would be unified rather than divided the way these other nations eventually would become. Remembering that it was their internal divisions that eventually weakened and caused the downfall of each of those other empires. The word bird here then includes both the pigeon and the turtle dove, seeing that the Jewish people are scattered in the four directions of the globe and have yet remained a single people, clinging to their Torah and their faith in spite of being scattered all over the world. The people of Israel did not trade their religion for another in spite of the heavy burden involved in enduring exile. So the symbolism of us as these birds, the turtle dove, the pigeon, the dove, whichever way you want to try to translate these, is even more than just, well, that's what we get mentioned as in Shir HaShirim. It is reminding us that we are scattered like birds, meaning that we have flown around the world because of the difficulties in our history. And yet, despite having been scattered to the four corners, we remain together. We remain united. We are not cut into pieces in the world either, nor have we been cut to pieces, meaning giving up on our faith, our people, and our ways. So those two little birds at the very end of the list seem insignificant next to the cow and the goat and the ram, and yet their intactness, their completeness, as you can see from our commentators, is incredibly powerful in its symbolism. And we're just going to finish off with one more quote from Radak, because I really think he nailed this discussion. This vision contained two separate allusions. First and foremost is its part in concluding the covenant with Avram, a symbol of two humans walking between two parts of something which represented each party's portion of the covenant, treaty, or pact, as we discussed. We find another example of this confirming a pact, a covenant in Jeremiah, again, where we talked about in chapter 34, the calf which they cut into so as to pass between the halves. Now, I wanted to save it for the end here so I would be able to tell how much time we had. That story in Jeremiah 34, I highly recommend you go and read it because in its entirety, because it is an incredibly powerful statement of how we did fall apart at the end of the First Temple period, and how we did, in many ways, literally cut our people into pieces. This is the section where Jeremiah convinces the people to release anybody that had sold themselves into servitude, and to release them in accordance with the laws of sabbatical release, which they had not been doing up till that point. And they made a promise indeed that they would finally follow through with what God had told them to release people according to the sabbatical cycle. And they made this pact, they walked between the animals, and then they went and recaptured them and brought them back in to serve them again. This again is a Jewish versus Jewish conflict, that Jewish people who had accepted the sale of a person as a servant freed them and then retook them as a perpetual captive in violation of so many different aspects of Torah, and in violation of this covenant that they had just acted out of walking between the pieces to symbolize that indeed they would keep that. And Jeremiah basically says, look, we're done, right? If you cannot even keep yourself together, if you cannot keep the basic covenant between a human and human, then there is no hope for the nation against its enemies. There is no hope for a future for Israel or the kingdom of Judah at this current time. And indeed, Jeremiah very accurately predicted the coming storm of Babylon, which eventually did destroy the kingdom of Judah, destroyed the first temple, and carried our people off entirely as captives, in a sort of poetic justice of how we had been treating ourselves was then treated. We were then together treated the same way. And unfortunately, we had to relearn the importance of being one people, Am Echad, in that period of captivity in Babylon. But back to Avram, following up on this symbolic phenomenon, we read here in verse 18, on that day, God had concluded a covenant with Avram, etc. In that verse, we have the word saying, which introduces a second aspect of the covenant, meaning that during all the many years that the exiles will last, God on his part will remember this covenant with the Jewish people, the descendants of Avram, and not totally abandon them. This same flame of fire, which originally signified the concluding of the covenant, will eventually consume those who defied the bond between Israel and God, by cruelly suppressing them and trying to wean them away from their God, meaning the non-Jewish oppressors. This will occur during the wars of Gog and Magog, which of course is referred to in Ezekiel 38 when we talk about the end of days and the transition to Olam Haba. So what is very powerful in my mind from Radak's concluding commentary here is that God is very upfront with Avram. Your descendants will be like the stars of the heaven, and they're going to suffer a lot, that the two are not mutually contradictory. And I will promise the land to them, but they will be exiled a lot. And again, it is not mutually contradictory. This is, the chapter 15 is not establishing a permanent status, meaning that things will always be perfectly good for every single person on this particular piece of land for all time, but rather the promise will never be canceled, even though there will be so many things that occur that one might think that it had been canceled. No matter how bad things get, the promise still stands. No matter how long we have been away from the land, the promise still stands. That is what a covenant means, that you are not making a short-term contractual agreement. You are making a long-term open-ended commitment to a relationship. And indeed, here we are 3,000 years later, and the covenant still stands. We have endured horrible parts of our history, and yet we have survived despite it. And we have been exiled from our land for many, many hundreds and thousands of years, and yet we have returned again and again. The proof of this passage of chapter 15 is our own continued presence, our own continued existence. When people ask for proof of Torah, you can say chapter 15 is about as compelling a proof as you can get. Not only does it prove that the people writing it were well aware of the covenantal model that would have been familiar for Avram, but it also proves that indeed the arc of history would play out exactly as described, and that we are the living proof of that. And hopefully we will find more good days ahead than bad, and hopefully we will reach that eventual part of the timeline where we are able to establish firmly peace and security and justice for everyone, not only us, but also those other nations that have been divided and slaughtered in their own way throughout the course of history. And it's up to us to try and make that happen sooner rather than later. With that, I will open it up for additional questions or comments. All right, everybody is shy today. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. I will talk to everyone hopefully soon. A reminder that tonight we are going to have our final Mishnah class for this cycle. We'll probably restart Mishnah or some other text course eventually, but we'll be using that time slot for another opportunity to come together in person to study and talk, but more about that to come. Take care, everyone, and be well.